Great is thy faithfulness. Great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning, new mercies I see. All I hath needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. You ask if there's relevance to the books we study. The author of Lamentations certainly thought so. Those words, morning by morning, the mercies of God unfold before me. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, taken directly from Lamentations chapter 3 to verse 23. But we're not at Lamentations yet, just a little taste of what's to come. So we are back in Jeremiah, and Jeremiah, boy, it feels like, this is a season for maybe getting a snowblower out and you're pulling that crank, trying to get it started, and it starts and then it dies and you're pulling it. You feel a little bit like it's a little back and forth. All right, we're in the moment now. Now we're talking about the past. Wait a minute, now we're talking about everybody's in exile that has just been predicted. And then now we're back in the past again. So there's a lot of jumping around in terms of timeline. If you're looking for a book that goes from A to B in a linear succession, Jeremiah is not the book that you probably are looking for. But it is a compilation of the prophet's predictions, his work through those who also worked with him. Baruch, who is a scribe and friend of Jeremiah's, and who probably wrote Lamentations itself. So we're in the second part of Jeremiah. Last time we ended with chapter 29. We're going to go from 39 on today. And chapter 30 really begins with God's promise to restore the people to the land, back to well, let me ask you this before we get rolling too far down the line. As you're reading Jeremiah and you're looking at the details of the exile. We talk about the exile, big exile, right? But Jeremiah tells us it's 4,000, what's the number? 4,800 people. So your reaction to that? When you read that the exile that we talk about is, catastrophic, which it was, a situation for Jerusalem, but it is 4,800 people in a city that's probably 50, 1,000 or more. And there's a lot of people left behind, the poor folks. And Nebuchadnezzar tells them they're going to, watch over the vineyards and the estates, the farms, and things of others. If you didn't have any land before. So as you're hearing about the exile, did any of those kind of thoughts pop into your mind, or maybe not really? No?
I didn't catch the number, or I don't remember. It's been a while since I read it.
That's okay. That's all right. It's a tough. Jeremiah's a tough read. Yeah. Well, anyway, we'll revisit that thought. Because we're talking again about the leadership of Israel. And something that struck me really powerfully this time is so Jeremiah's been warning the king, warning Zedekiah, when Babylon comes, you should surrender, right? And it sounds like Babylon's coming and Zedekiah's got to make up his mind and they got to do this. But then when we read further in the second part of Jeremiah, they're camped outside of Jerusalem for a couple months. And eventually the king and the leaders make a bolt for it when they tear a hole in the wall and they try to escape. But it's not like he hasn't had some time to really mull this over and to decide whether or not to surrender. But anyway, God tells him to warn the people. God tells him that if they surrender and if they give themselves up, that Zedekiah will die in peace. He'll eat from the table of the king of Babylon. His sons will survive. His family will survive. The people, though the destruction has happened up till this point, the Babylonians will leave them alone other than making them a vassal state, but everything will be good. And then they don't, and they think he's unpatriotic. And then the general of the people, when that Nebuchadnezzar puts up, I'm just summarizing here, Nebuchadnezzar, cliff notes for those of you who might not have gotten to it, he puts up this governor to rule the country. Some of the people, for whatever reason, want to assassinate the governor, and they do. The leader, the general of the army of Israel, tells this governor that they're planning on killing him and that they should be punished or stopped. And then Jeremiah tells, after the governor's assassinated, and the rest of the leaders who haven't been deported yet in exile, say, we got to get out of here, let's go to Egypt. Do you remember this? Everybody's looking at me kind of strangely. We got to get out of here. We got to go to Egypt because Nebuchadnezzar's going to kill us all because he's going to be furious that we killed his guy. So let's get out of here. Let's get while the getting's good. And Jeremiah says, God says, stay here. Don't go. You go to Egypt, it's going to end up badly. You're all going to die. You stay here, you live in peace. But it's kind of counterintuitive, right?
You have to live in exile then also, right? If they do that.
He says, stay in the land, and they'll have peace. Now, he doesn't say whether they'll go into exile or not, but he does say if they go to Egypt, they're dead. Now, there's some political things going on here too, because the whole reason, one of the big reasons that Babylon initially attacks Israel is because Israel's king and leaders align with Egypt. So you got the two bullies on the block, right? You got Babylon up here in the northeast. You got Egypt down in the southwest. They don't like each other. Babylonians want to get at them. Egyptians want to get at them. In the middle of the crosshairs is Judah. And Judah decides, well, we'll take our bets we'll back the horse of Egypt. It's the wrong horse to back, and they get crushed. But so there's a lot of back and forth. And each time, though, Jeremiah says something that, I think we touched on this last time, but if the United States was next week invaded by China, and the Chinese are in the Mexican border and the Canadian border, and they're surrounding the east and the west coast with warships, and some major church leader said, all right, God says we should just surrender. How would that fly?
No, think it would happen.
Not a chance, right? Not a chance. And what would happen to that faith leader?
Some might excommunicate him. Yeah.
Excommunicated, ousted out, death threats, I am sure, whether or not people followed through with them. You're just, some kind of commie sympathizing, you're
nuts.
You're crazy, right? No red-blooded patriot is going to do those things. But that's exactly what Jeremiah tells the people of Israel. Don't fight. You're going to lose. God says you're going to lose because Babylon is actually the instrument of God to punish you for your unfaithfulness. Super unpopular message. So Jeremiah is put under house arrest. Then they throw him in a cistern with mud and they leave him to die. Very similar to the story of Daniel in the lion's den. The king. Did you pick up on this? The king, let me get that from the notes here because I forget where it was. The king decides, the king seems to absolve himself of any responsibility for Jeremiah getting thrown in the cistern. It's like the leaders of Israel are too strong for him to do anything about it. But secretly the king goes and has people fish him out of there.
The king is in Nebuchadnezzar?
The king Zedekiah, Judah's king. So the leaders of Israel, and this is before they get punished, before his kids get killed, and before he gets taken to Babylon with his eyes gouged out. This is before all that happens. Pre-eye gouging. This is when Jeremiah is just saying, hey, we should surrender. And then the leaders say, oh yeah, we're going to shut you up. We'll throw you in a well that's so deep that everybody will forget about you. And then the king, very much like you see, the king in Esther, forgetting about Mordecai, or the king in Daniel, forgetting or feeling bad that he had passed laws that Daniel gets thrown in the lion's den. He feels remorse that Jeremiah is being punished, so he has them fish Jeremiah out and put him under house arrest again, but he doesn't listen to him. So he cares enough about him that he respects him, and he respects his life and sees him as an agent of God, but he won't listen to him. So we got that dynamic, and I wish I could remember where exactly that was in the text. But
The cistern.
yeah, just after he's tossed in the cistern, which is where? 38? Okay.
Saved by the eunuch.
Yeah, yeah.
So Zedekiah did believe that he was like an agent of God or an instrument of God. He believed that.
Yeah, he has him in his court. He hears him out. At times it seems like Zedekiah is going to listen. One thing I don't know for certain that would be interesting, it would be really interesting to know, is specifically Zedekiah's age when this is happening in this moment, and like things that we can have a rough ballpark of, but we don't know, like if he's a young king, if he's in his teens or if he's in his early 20s, and all of his advisors are 40s and 50s, but they've advised his father and his father before him perhaps. You have that power dynamic of perhaps a young king who's a little bit uncertain of himself. You have one prophet saying, God's telling you to do this, and then you got all these other guys saying, yeah, we're just going to fight it out. You'll be remembered as a coward if you do that versus, go down the halls of greatness if you do this. So I think a lot of thought also just from a kind of modern standpoint is who gives you counsel in life and how does it affect, your spiritual walk with God. Is something I think really plays into here. Now, we have also, before we get too far down the line, let's just start to go through this, slog through this. So God says that people are we'll start in 30, we'll go into here, chapter 34. So if you'll turn to 34 with me. So Jeremiah is telling them again that Nebuchadnezzar is going to come, burn the city with fire. You won't escape unless you surrender. And then I found something very interesting. So you've all read the Torah. You've all read that first part in our previous readings. In verse 8, chapter 34. After King Zedekiah had made a covenant with all the people of Jerusalem to make a proclamation of freedom to them, or liberty to them, that all should set their Hebrew slaves, male and female, free, so that no one should hold another Judean in slavery. Now, that's interesting, because clearly, in this time in Judah, Hebrew people are owning other Hebrew people. We know that if we remember from Samuel, the prophet Samuel, one of his critiques of King Solomon, and one of the revisionist authors of that book, you have two different voices. One that says Solomon had a taskmaster who enslaved and beat fellow Judeans and fellow Israelites, something that was frowned upon by God and that they weren't supposed to do from Deuteronomy. And then you have another voice in 2 Samuel, or 1 Kings, that says Solomon didn't enslave any of the fellow Hebrews, but only foreigners. But there's this big deal between who you're enslaving, right? Because you were slaves in the land of Egypt. So there are places, and I included them in your electronic notes, where, and I was surprised by this because I didn't realize this. In Exodus and Deuteronomy, there are some places where it says you can own a Hebrew slave if they're working off a debt, but you have to release them after 6 years. Except in the book of Leviticus, where it says, under no circumstances can you ever own a fellow Hebrew because you were slaves in Egypt. So two theologies of whether it's permissible or not to own a fellow Hebrew slave. One with the condition that it's okay if they owe you a debt they can't repay to work it off as a slave or servant. The other saying, under no circumstances. So it's very similar to the New Testament. It says you can never get divorced except by infidelity, versus, Paul saying, well, if you're unequally yoked in faith, you can do that too. But there's different voices on what's permissible, what's not, different interpretations of that. Same thing, it turns out, with holding a slave, which I didn't realize. And I just point out to you as random something that's interesting because clearly during Jeremiah's time, people own people, and it's a judgment of God that they haven't let them go. They've freed them and then they've enslaved them right back as one of the reasons why Israel's being punished. So it's interesting. At least I found it interesting. Okay. We have the group of Rechabites in chapter 35. You're not going to see them many other places in Scripture. This is an unusual group of people that happens. And then you're going to have all these judgments on Israel and then the other nations. So it expands. And Jeremiah goes into this kind of, Israel's being punished because of infidelity to God, but Egypt's going to be punished, Moab's going to be punished, Edom's going to be punished. You just go on down the line of all the enemies of Israel, they're all going to get theirs too. And then the book moves into a movement from judgment into redemption. Okay. So before I keep, because I'm talking way too much again, things that stood out to you in the reading, or things that were confusing to you in this closing part of the closing half of Jeremiah.
I was confused with the kings. Because at the end, this other king who was before Zedekiah is eating with the king, with Nebuchadnezzar, not Nebuchadnezzar, his son or whoever took over after him.
Yeah,
so
he's...
like, what? How is this?
Yeah. Yeah, you have him being imprisoned by Nebuchadnezzar, but being served at his table and living a peaceful life and no problems, right?
But why is his...
And was that his... All right, where are we at, Lynn? Do you remember?
52, I think. I looked at a chart and it was very confusing. There were like a whole bunch like in a row.
Oh, it was
Jehoiakim, who was before Zedekiah, I think.
Well, they often have the same names, I don't know.
So, yeah, that's... Remember when... Probably not, but remember when in 2 Chronicles, it gets very confusing because the king of Judah and the king of Israel have the same name. And it says the one from Israel goes up against the one from, but it doesn't say, it doesn't always use them and tell you which one they're talking about. So it's hard to follow which king it is. And I find that to also be true. You're not alone in that, Lynn, with some of the back and forth, because again, it's not linear, so it is hard to keep track of. And specifically, you're looking at, in 52...
So it looks like there's more than one king of Judah.
Right.
captivity.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're looking at
The last few verses.
31.
In the 37th year of the exile of the king.
So and you looked up a timeline of the kings because
Yeah,
it sounds to me like he's.
vertical and, like, there's different lines and I don't understand.
This one sounds like a successor of Zedekiah.
But
to me.
Zedekiah is the one who was king when the Babylonians took over, right?
Correct.
So, and I think he's a prior king.
Well,
The Babylonian guy or
No,
the
Jehoiakim.
see, but for him to be in Babylon and to then, during the exile, because this guy's been in exile for 37 years. And then there's a change of Babylonian king.
how about that name?
Yeah, evil Merodach. And then that change of king changes his fortunes. But it is confusing because Zedekiah's sons are all killed before his eyes, right? So there is no prince.
No, he's on the charts, this Jehoiakim or something.
Okay.
Um,
Well, let me ask you this. Who follows Zedekiah on the chart?
nobody.
Nobody. That would be problematic. Because Israel continues to retain a king. Well-
It's a dotted line from Jehoiakim to Zedekiah.
Okay.
What does that mean?
Okay.
On the key, it doesn't have a dotted line.
All right. Well, that's a great question, and we'll have to take a peek at that in the off time between classes, because I am not sure. Yeah, it is strange. It is strange.
Not only strange, but ironic, because Zedekiah was promised peace and favor, but, and then it ends up that his successor is still in exile and the king is being good to him. I mean, it's just weird that it worked out that way.
Precursor.
Or if it's a king that's taken prisoner to Babylon, but Judah hasn't fallen yet, so that doesn't make sense to me. Although I seem to remember, I seem to remember a text where Jehoiakim, who is before Zedekiah, is taken prisoner by the Babylonians by chain and hook because of his arrogance. So the question then becomes, do they just say, all right, forget that king, we're just going to have a new king then, and Zedekiah becomes king while there's another king in exile? I don't know. Those are questions we'll have to look into. Questions we have to look into for next time. Good observation, Lynn. Good questions. Other things that stood out to you guys?
Yeah, that doesn't sound like peace with your eyes gouged out. And your
Well, remember, Zedekiah is going to get peace if he surrenders. He chose door number 2, which is fleeing and fighting it out, and for that reason, Jeremiah tells him that's what the problem is. Okay. Let's see here. Any other things that stood out to you about this last part of Jeremiah? So, a couple of other pieces. We have the poor people staying in Judah. Interestingly, a portion of them are going to oppose the exiles when they return, when they're rebuilding the wall and the city. So there might be some dynamics of, we don't mind that you guys were gone. Uh,
We're living in your house.
some of them are foreigners. You know, you'll see that in Ezra and Nehemiah. Some of them are foreigners that are stirring up trouble, but some of them are Israelites who just were left behind. And then so we have, I'm going to read the names. Gedaliah, who is the governor appointed by Nebuchadnezzar. So you have Gedaliah, who is assassinated, and then you have Jonahan, son of Kareah, who's the general, trying to warn him that he's going to be assassinated. That story of, should we go down to Egypt or should we stay? And it's really interesting when you read chapter 43, Jeremiah tells them to stay, God will protect them, Nebuchadnezzar is not going to punish them or hold them accountable for this, which they think sounds really dicey. They all move. Jeremiah moves with them
I thought that was weird.
down to
Don't go,
Talphins.
you'll be punished, but he
Well, it
goes with
said,
Yeah.
it said in, I mean, I don't know what translation, like, but mine said that he was forced to go. It was not like it was an optional.
Ah,
Like, I remember the wording out
because
because,
he's under house
That's
arrest.
what the Bible
yeah, I guess,
project
but yeah,
said.
so it wasn't his choice.
That he,
That's not what I read. Yeah, I just read it.
mine's not that. Let's take a look at that. Does anybody remember where that piece is in chapter 43? Let's take a peek, see if we can find that, because I'd be interested to hear the translational differences here. So, not go to Egypt. Jonadab, verse 4, and the commanders forces all the people didn't obey the word to stay in the land, and all the commanders took all the remnant of Judah who had returned to settle in the land, men, women, children, and princesses, and everyone whom Nebuzaradan, captain of the guard, left with. And Baruch arrived at Talphanes. Then the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah in Talphanes. So I don't have anything in my text that says they forced it. Barb, did you find in yours?
Where was, it's 43 you said?
Yeah, I'm reading
I
43.
feel like it was a little thing, I feel like it was like some, I mean, I don't know, I read it before, so I wasn't reading it during the reading week. But I remembered it was almost like an afterthought, like at the end of a paragraph or something, it was like,
Verse 6.
and, of 43?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it says, and they took Jeremiah the prophet and Baruch son of Neriah along with them.
Yeah, end of verse 6.
And also the prophet Jeremiah.
And they took, yeah, I guess maybe the took, and they took him, I guess that
Yeah.
made me, I mean, if someone takes me versus it doesn't feel like
Yeah.
a choice, it's like they took him with.
But yours doesn't even have his name there?
Mine has his name, yeah. Yeah, Jeremiah the prophet and Baruch, son of Neriah. Yeah, it's really interesting. But in any account, he goes down there and warns them down there. You know, this is a mistake. You shouldn't have come down here. So, what is the role of a prophet? We've read Isaiah, we've read Jeremiah. If someone were to ask you, what the heck is a prophet? How would you answer that question?
To tell them whatever God told him to tell.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mouthpiece for God?
Yeah.
I was thinking about that, if somebody came to our church and God told me to tell you to,
Yeah.
we'd all like, well, maybe he needs counseling.
Uh,
Or
What was
drugs.
it
Maybe.
like then, historically, like at that time, was that normal? I mean, was that like, what did that look like then? Like, just like, in that setting, was that, I mean, was that a regular thing? Was that, like, did that seem normal to people? Was that, like you said, we'd say this person's got kind of something going on. Was it more acceptable or more normal or more typical back then?
well, we've got a lot of prophets, right? There's a lot of biblical
Then
prophets.
some of them are false, but like, I guess, I don't know, I that was something that I wondered a lot as I was reading it, is how people saw them then, because I think right now, people would really question it. I
Yeah.
think it would, in our culture, it would be like, you know,
Yeah.
but but I'm wondering if that was more, I mean, because obviously a lot of people did follow them and a lot of the leaders listened to them. I mean, they had a place in society, which they don't really now today.
It's a great question.
It did seem that, several of the kings would call for the prophet and come and
Yeah.
tell me
Right.
what you've heard.
Yeah.
And
So
either
it was like a thing.
follow or not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It wasn't
Like
like,
an advisor,
yeah,
or a spiritual
exactly,
advisor.
yeah.
And you're a mix of a monarchy / theocracy. You have a battle between kingly rule and priestly rule with God at the heart. So there's always that tug of war with Israel. Prophet saying we always want to be a theocracy. King saying this is my kingdom. It's a monarchy. And but what I can tell you is the occupation of a prophet, almost without exception, is a dangerous one in the Bible. They're beat up, they're killed, they're persecuted, they're exiled, they're thrown in wells, they're thrown to wild animals. They're not popular. So maybe another word for prophet is troublemaker.
Jesus would have been a prophet.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
for sure. And again,
Yeah, that's what they did to him.
uh,
There's nothing for the people to read.
right?
So it's the prophets that are telling them about God and spreading the word. And
Yeah,
what they should do and shouldn't do.
which is a great point. Yeah, they're by and large illiterate, and there's not many handwritten things anyway.
I wondered if they questioned, did he get it right from God? Maybe he's making a mistake.
Yeah, and how do you test that? So biblically, does it happen? Does what they say happen? And if it does, great. Then they're truly a true prophet. If it doesn't, then they got to be a false prophet, right?
You gotta wait.
Right. And so you have that dynamic. Remember the prophet Micaiah, who was challenging the prophet Nathan when he's imprisoned, and he makes the iron horns and he prances around, says the king should go attack, and they imprison Nathan, and is it Nathan? It might be Elijah. Well, all right, I might be missing out my prophets, but the prophet tells him, listen, you might put me in prison, but if you're alive tomorrow, then we'll know that you're telling him the truth. But I'm telling you, you're not going to be alive tomorrow. And the prophet, the guy who's mocking him, dies. So, well, you're right.
Case by case.
So when we crack into Ezekiel, all notions of the strange behavior of prophets are going to be blown out of proportion and magnified. I think he's my favorite prophet in some ways, just because he's so crazy. If you want to talk about trying to find ways to get people's attention in ways that will truly grab people's attention, look no further than Ezekiel. But we'll hold some of that for next time.
Were you referring to Hananiah at one point?
Yeah, there's a Hananiah as well.
Isn't that a situation where they kind of put them head to head and say, okay,
Yeah.
which one of your predicting
Yeah.
predictions is correct?
There's Hananiah, there's Micaiah, there's a guy that Jeremiah goes toe-to-toe with. Is it Hananiah in this one? Yeah, in Jeremiah. I'm thinking of one in the Kings. But yeah, there's these showdown. Elijah and the prophets of Baal with King Ahab. Remember on Mount Carmel? You have this showdown. I'm going to wet this altar down with whatever water we got. You guys can cut yourselves and dance and scratch yourselves all you want to the fertility god. We'll see who's the true one or not. So yeah, you have this battle for veracity and truth, who's genuine and who is not.
Sometimes where we struggle with it is that the prophet seems to be giving war advice, political advice, not just spiritual advice. The answer is, well, God's going to not be happy with you if you do it this way.
Yeah.
Or in today, where you'd have a spiritual leader or advisor or something, for example, to the president, they wouldn't, I don't think, tell them what to do in a situation where we were being invaded or at task with China or something like that. It would be totally different. Maybe that's what's different.
Likely, yeah, likely. Yeah. And prophets say things that are unpopular,
Yeah.
that by and large people do not want to hear, that afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted, as a turn of phrase that we often use today. But that is true. They disquiet people who are profiting off of others' misfortune or doing great at the misfortune or at the hands of others, who don't care about others. They call us to task on, are we just paying lip service to God, or do we really live out what God calls us to be? And nobody's going to be, that's not going to be popular with anybody. Nobody likes, think of,
Martin Luther King, we generally assassinate them.
or just think of your own friends who are bluntly honest with you. When they initially tell you something that you don't want to hear from them, but they are honest, they're a good friend. So they'll tell you something that you're doing that is out of line. What's your first reaction usually to that? Yeah. Who do you think you are? Well, I could point out a few of your flaws. You know, and but that truthfulness, ideally, from the prophetic voice, leads to a disquieting, it leads to self-examination, and ideally it leads to repentance and turning back to God, turning back to your faith, is the role of a prophet. Not only as a mouthpiece, but to get people to move from A to be faithful again. And, you know, we'll talk about what success for a prophet means. You know, you have Jeremiah, who's successful in saying what God asked him to do, but nobody listens. Then you have Jonah, who doesn't want to do what God tells him to do, and everybody listens, and he's upset. So, you know, how do you measure prophetic success? How are we doing here? So we have, towards the end of the book of Jeremiah, and then we'll get into Lamentations. In that last chapter, where we have the kingly challenge there, we also have a different voice. It's no longer the voice of the narrator and the prophet. Clearly we have a shift of voice to probably most likely Baruch, and you know, gives an accounting of how many exiles there are in that chapter, and gives some more details that we hadn't had in the entirety of the book. In fact, I think it's really interesting because you have all this kind of narrow detail of the daily life and struggle of Jeremiah, and then in chapter 52 it kind of goes into this wide angle lens, and you see, well, this has been going on for months, that the prophet's been trying to talk to the king, the king's refusing. Then it's just a small number of the leaders who are taken in actuality, where if you were to read the book of Jeremiah, just the first 51 chapters, the exile sounds like it could be tens of thousands of people taken. You know, half the population is deported. But that's not the case that we learn to see. All right. Any last questions before we...
Chapter was that?
That's chapter 52, that last chapter.
So some of them are in Judah still, some are in Babylon, and some are in Egypt.
Yeah.
And then some of both of them, but you know, supposedly all the ones that went to Egypt are going to die.
Yeah.
I was literally say every single one will die, but those who are left,
Yes, yes.
they always say that.
It's similar to Joshua, right, where we killed every last one of them. Oh, and the people of that place the people of Hazor are now still causing us problems. Well, wait a minute. You know, so yeah, there is that hyperbole. And there's also that, we get from the book of Jeremiah that a lot of people fled knowing the Babylonians are coming. So they went to Edom and Moab and Amnon.
So
and
they're coming back from all these places?
so they're going to return.
But is it still Babylonian rule?
The prophetic prediction is going to be that Babylon is, the last one in Jeremiah is Babylon itself is also going to be punished from this new kingdom to the north. which we're going to find out is Persia. And the return will be, isn't determined, like he doesn't spell out that it's going to be Cyrus of Persia, but we find out that that's ultimately who defeats Babylon. Babylon ceases to be, so in that way the prophet is correct. That kingdom is destroyed, wiped out. And then the Persians take over and return the exiles to...
That's why there's no more Judah, kings of Judah.
Mm-hmm.
It's still
Right.
ruled by
Right,
someone else.
ruled by, they have a governor in Jeremiah, but they don't have a king until Judas Maccabeus in the Maccabean times. Okay? All right.
So I do have
Yeah.
one other thing that jumped out. The actual exile in Babylon doesn't sound all that horrible when you read Jeremiah 29. Because it talks about, build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat what they produce, take wives and have sons and daughters. It sounds like a normal life is promised.
Yeah, it's,
But
so they have shelter, they have daily provisions. The trauma is everything they lost. They are
strange
butchered,
land
and there's nobody in Judah that hasn't lost family in the Babylonian siege. Jerusalem's the last town of 3 standing. Everything else has been annihilated. So it is a pretty complete conquest of Judah. And back to, Lynn had asked about the temple. Are there 3 temples? So they rebuild the walls, and they go to the temple site and remember what was compared to what is. But they haven't rebuilt the temple as a complete second. They worship at the site with the ruins and whatever.
What was Cyrus?
No, you had asked a couple of weeks ago about, it being confusing because you have Solomon's temple, and then you have the return from exile, and they're going and in Habakkuk, and they're remembering this house and what it was versus what it is, which kind of makes it seem like they've returned, they've rebuilt the walls. Have they rebuilt the temple? No, whatever charred remains and pieces of the wall remain are what is the site of worship until Herod the Great, and he fully rebuilds it.
I was thinking that Cyrus sent a bunch of stuff
Sent a bunch of stuff, but it's mostly the wall that they're repairing, and they're not rebuilding the entirety of the temple. It doesn't fully happen until Herod.
Because they brought the stuff back, right? Like they brought the different.
Yeah, a lot of the articles of worship and things.
Yeah.
So they're
So
worshiping.
that all came back, but they didn't.
I mean, imagine the church, God forbid, but the church burns down and fellowship's hall and part of 2 is still viable to meet. So you have church there, but it's not what was. And the rest of the edifice is gone. So I think it's kind of that situation. So moving into Lamentations, a book that's nowhere quoted in the New Testament. This is kind of a dirge, right? It is what we would call it in English, a lament, which is probably we talk about, this is an aside, but I think it's really important. We talk about the book of Numbers, as we know it in English, is in Hebrew the book of wanderings. It has a different meaning based on its title, different emphasis. We emphasize the counting of the tribes. The Hebrew name emphasizes the journey in the wilderness. Lamentations we emphasize the sorrow of the destruction of Jerusalem. In the Hebrew Bible, the title of the book is How? And it's a question, which I think is really powerful in understanding this book from a Hebrew side of things. So for us, it's the sorrow of loss is the focus of how we read. The lens at which we're choosing to name the book and read it is everything that's been lost.
By us, do you mean
English.
English or
English.
Christian?
English and Christian.
Both.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, Christian English readers of the Hebrew Bible. But for a Jew, it's not the dejection and sorrow. It is how did we, God's people, come to this? How did we allow this to happen? How do we hang on to God in this moment? All the questions of relationship with God that has been damaged or is strained is the focus. Now, maybe I'm nitpicking a little bit, but I think a little bit is lost when we view it through our lens versus through those questions, those unanswered. It's not meant to be answered, it's meant to be wrestled with and to sit with the tension of the distress of where are we in time as a people of God? Because all seems pretty dark and lost, and God seems far away. And then you have moments like chapter 3 that says, great is God's faithfulness. God sees us in this moment. But even in the end of Lamentations, it ends with questions. Verse 21, restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we might be restored. Renew our days of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. So we believe that God is good and God will restore us. But maybe we're too far gone. And we don't know. And we're not sure. How can this be put back together? That's Humpty Dumpty's fallen off the wall. Can we repair it? Or is it untenable? And to me, though Lamentations is only a short 5 chapters, it's that really guttural sense of, has God abandoned us? Or did we step out on God, and God's faithfulness has a limit? God's goodness has God's patience with us, that's what I want to say. God's patience with us has a limit, and we've exhausted it. Or maybe not. And the author wants to believe that there's no way that we have, even though it sure seems like we have. It's a much more dire book. It's not very happy. There's hope in it, but it's a silver lining hope in a massive thunderstorm, where it doesn't look like this is going to let up anytime soon.
That's incredibly helpful, because I've always struggled with it because they deposit everything on God, which is the Jewish way. But for God to be so terrible, to break their bones and every other descriptor that's especially in chapter 3 before we get to the goodness of God, I couldn't imagine in my mind, how does one hold that tension? How can one moment God be this heinous thing that is punishing them beyond measure, but I still have hope in you? I mean, that's like, oh wow. But putting it in that question phase, that they kind of saying, I understand why you did it, because the problem is me. The problem is not you, God.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is me, and we invoke all of this. I love that it.
Yeah.
Or how did we get there, and how do we get back? Yeah, still believing that God.
I mean, maybe another analogy that's helpful is, you get into you fall in love with somebody, you get into a relationship, you decide, hey, I want to spend my life with you. And then somewhere along the line, you're not talking as much, you're distant from each other. And one day you wake up and say, how did I get here? How did we go from here 10 years ago or 30 years ago or 5 years ago or a year ago to here where the relationship's unrecognizable? it's not apples and apples, but it's similar, and maybe it's helpful to, from a human perspective, thinking about that question of how did I, how was it so good and now is it salvageable? And that's right in line with the questions of Lamentations and what is the future? Is it half full or is it almost empty? So with that, I'm going to kind of leave that there because that's where Lamentations leaves it. It doesn't answer it, doesn't tie it up in a bow. It just leaves it uncomfortably unknown. To introduce Ezekiel to you and to ask a question of you. So I sent out the revised schedule. The question I have for you, Ezekiel is 41 chapters? 48. Now, it is shorter than both Isaiah and Jeremiah both, but if you would like a reading week next week to tackle Ezekiel and then cover it the week after, we absolutely can do that. Happy to do that. If you don't want to do that, voice your displeasure now. And to give you one more thing to think about before you make that decision is this. Pastor Michelle and I were talking and thought that as we're taking this Christmas 2-week break around Holy Week and New Year's, that it might be helpful or something that might be open to or fun for the class is that Christmas week, the 20th of December, when normally we would meet and it's a class off, she and I would be happy to do just the birth narratives. One of us will take Matthew, one of us will take Luke, and just go through the birth stories so you can see them side by side, hear the different voices, hear the different emphasis as we go into Christmas. And we would be happy to do that if that's something you all would like to do. It would take a little bit off when we start the Gospels in the new year, but it might be a fun Christmas activity if you all would like to do that. We'd be happy to do that. You can read, you not read, either way. It's 2 chapters each Gospel, Luke and Matthew, but you don't have to read it to, I think, get something out of it. Would that be something you would like to do?
I would.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, then we'll do that December 20th. Great. I'll send that out. Do you want a reading week for next week for Ezekiel? Yes. Great. So, as you're gearing up for Ezekiel, you're going to see some strange stuff. I don't want to spoil too much of it. God will tell Ezekiel to get down to his birthday suit and build some dioramas and some models. God will tell him to cook over poop and eat it in front of people. God will tell him to do Ezekiel has a lot of weird visions about heaven and about God and about creatures and wheels and faces and eyes and wings. It's going to be interesting. A cross between Led Zeppelin concert and some drug addicts maybe, but you're going to get some interesting visions from Ezekiel and some of the most powerful visions and pieces of scripture like the valley of dry bones, like the sheep and the goats that sets up Matthew 25. There's just a lot of neat stuff in this book. It's a lot easier to read than Jeremiah, I promise, because it is linear. And but it's also dealing with Babylon. And so we'll have that in similarities. The difference will be that Ezekiel is going to start off in Babylon. The exile, this is a prophet to those in exile. So it's happened already. And we'll talk about how good or easy they have it versus how daunting the exile is next time in 2 weeks when we cover the prophet Ezekiel. All right?
So do we have a different assignment then for the 20th? Are we going to read?
The 20th is...
the December 20th.
If you would like, and I'll put this in an email to everybody,
Okay.
If you would like, you read the first 2 chapters of Matthew and Luke. But you don't have to do that. You absolutely don't have to do that. You could just come, chill out that week, and we'll just talk about it.
No, I always do my reading
We'll,
sessions.
we'll,
Always.
we'll walk you.
Spoken like a true teacher.
We will quite literally walk you through it because it's just 2 chapters. We'll just go through it and point out things, and each of us again will take a different gospel. So you'll hear, because I want you to hear the birth narratives from 2 different perspectives, because we put them together and blend them up to make one story, but they're very different stories about the birth of Jesus and what was happening and why, and who was there and who wasn't, and whose perspective it's told from. So yeah, we'll do that December 20th.